Let me ask you a very personal question. If you're single, are you interested in getting married? Perfectly fine if you're not. A lot of people these days don't seem to want to. And no, I'm not asking for myself. Let's get that clear right away. But say you were interested, how would you actually go about finding the right person to marry? A setup through family or friends? Dating apps maybe? Or what about a matchmaking service, if that's even a thing where you live? Would you try it? For most of human history, and still in many, many parts of the world, a matchmaker is basically a person, someone older and wise, maybe like your aunt, who for a fee introduces you to people in their network that they think you would click with. It's very personal and human. Now, what if I told you that's not really how things work in South Korea, like at all? Because in South Korea, you don't go to a person, you go to a company, an agency. And chances are, you've already come across one without even being aware of it, because their ads are like absolutely everywhere in Seoul. TV commercials, billboards lining the subway stations. We're talking about a serious industry here. And they seem to be absolutely killing it right now, even in a brutal economic environment. Young Koreans are struggling to find stable jobs, let alone afford a home. The won, the Korean currency, recently sank to its weakest level against the dollar since 2009. Small businesses are under serious pressure, but somehow these agencies seem almost recession-proof, a counter-cyclical business that keeps making money even as the rest of the economy struggles. Take the biggest player, a marriage agency called Duo. Its revenue grew by more than 70% from 2020 to about 48 billion won in 2025, roughly 35 million US dollars. And that's just one company in an industry with around 1,100 registered matchmaking businesses across the country. And recently, Duo made national headlines when the personal records of over 420,000 members got hacked. When I first heard that, I was like, wait, they had over 420,000 members? That's a lot of people wanting to get married. Turns out, nearly 300,000 of those records were old data that Duo was supposed to delete years earlier, but didn't. So the real question is, what was sitting in those files? We'll get to exactly how personal those files were later, because it's gonna blow your mind. Anyway, the consequence for Duo? A fine of 1.2 billion won, or slightly over 800,000 US dollars, for a company generating roughly $35 million in annual revenue. The company was ordered to improve its data protection and notify affected users, but it didn't shut down. And from the outside looking in, at least, the scandal doesn't appear to have derailed the business at all. That's how entrenched this industry appears to have become. Here's the irony though. These agencies keep making more money even as South Korea's long-term marriage rate has collapsed, from around 10 weddings per 1,000 people in the early 1980s to roughly 4 today. And all of this is happening in a country where the fertility rate is still the lowest in the world, at just 0.8 children per woman. So how do these agencies actually work? Why do so many Koreans feel like they need one in the first place? And are they a symptom of Korea's marriage crisis, or are they part of what's making it worse? Or somehow both? Speaking of personal data being stolen, what happened at the Korean marriage agency should be a wake-up call for anyone thinking about protecting their personal data, even if you're not Korean. Because here's the thing, you don't even have to type your personal information into a random website to be vulnerable. Any company you voluntarily hand your information to, even in person, can store it in a database. And if that database gets hacked, your information can end up in the wrong hands. And why would bad actors want that information? Because personal data is valuable. Right now, an entire industry of data brokers, people search websites, and background check companies is quietly scraping the internet to build detailed profiles on you. That data can then be used by scammers and identity thieves to impersonate you, open credit cards in your name, or even take out loans under your stolen identity. That's why you need our sponsor, Incogni. Incogni doesn't just remove you from data broker sites. Through their custom removals feature, Incogni targets specific websites and platforms where your personal data may be exposed, sold, or traded. They contact these companies on your behalf, demand your information be deleted, and verify that it's been done. They handle everything so you don't have to spend months doing it yourself. If you want to protect your data from being exploited, try Incogni by scanning this QR code or using the link in the description. Use the code AsianBoss at incogni.com/AsianBoss to get 60% off an annual plan. That's 60% off to protect your identity and remove your personal information from places it shouldn't be. I highly recommend taking advantage of this offer. Let's get back to the deep dive. So the biggest question I had while researching this was, when exactly did traditional matchmakers turn into corporations? Assuming traditional matchmaking practice even existed in Korea in the first place. Yes, it absolutely did exist for a super long period of time out of pure practical necessity. Here's the context. For most of its history, which goes back as far as 2300 BC by a widely held Korean narrative to a mythical founder named Hangun, Korea ran on a strict class system. And I don't mean that like how we talk about the working class or the elite class of today. In the kingdom of Silla, which existed from 57 BC to 935 AD, the social hierarchy was so rigid it had a name, 골품제, which translates to the bone rank system. It was Silla's aristocratic ranking system, and the idea was that the literal bone you're born with, in other words your bloodline, decided everything for the rest of your life. Who you could marry, what job you could hold, even what you could wear. And marrying outside your rank? Basically forbidden. If you ever did marry outside of your rank, you would lose your rank, and so would your kids. Your whole bloodline got demoted, and you would get completely outcast by your peers and social circle. So think about what that does for marriage. Forget love or chemistry. It's all about two families merging to maintain the same social class, which means you would have to vet and screen a family's background before any match could happen, right? Sure, families could try to do this directly, especially if they already knew each other. But what happens when one family just lies about their background? So gradually, this gave rise to the need for a neutral third party, a matchmaker who could objectively size up both families for a fit. These matchmakers were called MEPA, which literally translates to go between women, or something like matchmaking granny. Usually old women whose job was knowing everybody, the families, the bloodlines, the reputations, and scandals. In a world where one lie about your background could completely wreck a marriage and your social standing forever, the good ones might as well have been private detectives. Now, the specific bone rank system I mentioned earlier died out when the Silla kingdom fell in 935 AD. But the underlying idea that you marry within your own class and that families have to be vetted before any match carried on in one form or another through every dynasty that followed, right up into modern times. Now, you could also ask, why was marrying within the same class such a big deal? Okay, you have to preserve your bloodline, sure. But was there any other reason? There was, a financial one. Let me give you an example. Let's fast forward about 700 years from the Silla kingdom era to the Joseon dynasty, which ran from 1392 to 1897. By the Joseon era, marriage had become a serious financial transaction between two families. So serious that a wedding without the proper exchange wasn't even considered a real respectable union. What kind of financial transactions? You probably heard the word dowry, which in most cultures means the money or property the bride's family pays to the groom's side for taking her in. But in Korea, it actually worked both ways. The groom's family would send gifts and silk along with a formal marriage letter in a box to the bride's family in an elaborate ceremony. In return, the bride's side sent their own gifts of respect to the groom's family and prepared the 혼수, which literally means marriage necessities. Basically, all the household goods to furnish the new couple's home. So this was a two-way exchange of real wealth between two families, which is exactly what made mutual vetting and the matchmaker who could do it even more necessary. Can you see it now? And this got so consequential in the Joseon era that the government actually had a system to subsidize marriage costs of poor noble families whose daughters might otherwise miss their window to marry because the family couldn't afford the 혼수. I swear I'm not making this up. It's in the royal records. And by the way, this exchange between families still exists in Korea today. It's just evolved. Now the groom is usually expected to provide the house And if he cannot buy one himself, which almost nobody can afford to anymore, his family chips in to bring that to the table, while the bride is expected to fill the new home with furniture and appliances, the fridge, the washing machine, and often buys her husband an expensive watch as part of the hunsu. We're talking a lot of money here. So with the stakes this high, the matchmaker had to evolve too. The well-connected grandma doing favors for the neighborhood was about to become something far more professional and a lot more cutthroat. Fast forward again to the 1970s and 80s. Korea, or South Korea by this point, is no longer a dynasty with strictly enforced class divisions. Slavery had been officially abolished back in 1894, the same sweeping reform that scrapped the old class system. There's actually a fascinating story here about how the slaves were freed and why a huge chunk of Koreans today share the same surnames, Kim, Lee, and Park. But that's a whole other topic. Let me know if you're interested. Anyway, by the 70s and 80s, the country is urbanizing at lightning speed. The economy is booming, and people are pouring out of the countryside into the capital, Seoul. A brand new district called Gangnam, which literally means south of the river, gets built up out of what was basically farmland and fields, and quickly becomes the playground of the new rich. And in this booming, status-obsessed new money world, a new kind of matchmaker appeared. Not grandmas. These were sharp, well-connected older women who arranged marriages for the wealthy and the elite. They operated out of fancy hotel coffee shops, the kind of place where chaebol families and politicians quietly met. The press called them Madame Du. The term itself actually came from a 1976 newspaper novel, and the media just ran with it until it became everyday slang. By the early 1980s, there were reportedly around 200 well-known Madame Dus working in Seoul alone, some running organized crews with a boss on top and dozens of people underneath. Almost like a crime syndicate. Police even tracked the famous factions by name. Now, why were the police interested in a bunch of high-class matchmakers? Because a lot of these matches were basically cons. The Madame Du would dress someone up, fake their background, like inflate their family's wealth or their job title, and pair them off with a family desperate to climb the social ladder. And when I say desperate, these weren't poor families. Rich parents wanted to marry their kids upward into an even better family, a bigger name, more money, more power. The Madame Du were the ones with the connections to make that arrangement happen. So families paid a fortune for it. To be fair, there were legit matchmakers who did the job honestly, but plenty were scammers. And by the time the parents realized they had been duped, the matchmaker had covered a track so well the money was long gone. The government tried crackdowns. They mostly failed because the victims were wealthy families too embarrassed to admit they had been scammed. So they wouldn't cooperate. In 1983 alone, there were over 100 reported cases of matchmaking scams. But scam or not, the Madame Du only served the rich and the elite. For the millions of ordinary Koreans now packed into the cities, well, they had to get married too. The problem was the old system of relying on a relative or village elder who knew everybody and could quietly vet the other family just wasn't there anymore. And make no mistake, family vetting and approval still meant a lot for ordinary Koreans. As late as 1980, arranged marriages still outnumbered love marriages roughly 6-4. And even among couples who married for love, about 7 out of 10 said their parents had objected. So regular, rising middle-class people were stuck. They still needed the vetting, that proof the other family was legit, but they had no reliable, affordable way to get it. That gap is exactly what the first matchmaking company saw. The first to really pull it off was a company called Sunwoo, founded in 1991 by a 25-year-old named Wongjin Lee. His thesis was, what if you took everything the matchmaker did, the vetting, the background checks, the introductions, and turned it into an actual business model at scale? Transparent, verifiable, open to anyone who could pay a membership fee, not just the rich. He coined the term couple manager, basically a company-employed matchmaker who works off of a database of members instead of a village granny's memory. What database? Well, the founder literally created something he called a spouse index, a scoring system that boiled a person down to a number, quantifying their socioeconomic factors like job, education, and income, their physical attractiveness like height, and their family background. Based on that system, he claims to have married off more than 30,000 people, earning him the nickname the matchmaking president. Sunwoo is widely considered Korea's first proper marriage information company. But the one that turned this into an entire industry almost by itself came along in 1995. The company was called Duo. In 2026, you see their ads everywhere. You have foreigners visiting Seoul wondering, what the hell does this company actually do? Because all you see is a beautiful young couple looking blissfully in love. It looks more like a luxury fashion campaign than anything. But what they're selling is matchmaking. And they're a mainstream brand that every Korean would recognize. Duo was founded in 1995 by a man named Sung Han-jung, who got the idea while studying in the United States of all places. He had seen how differently dating and marriage worked over there and recognized a cultural gap. He came back to Korea to build something that fit Korean culture. But in its early days, Duo had the same problem that every matchmaking business faces. I mean, the market was there, but you can't match people if you don't have enough people, right? No one wants to join a service with a tiny pool. So in the beginning, Duo was scrambling just to collect names, reportedly gathering university alumni directories to build up a roster. They almost went bankrupt more than once. Then in 1997, Duo made a marketing move that, quite frankly, might still work today. They didn't buy a bunch of ads. Instead, they walked into MBC, one of Korea's major broadcast networks, and pitched them a show. The idea was a TV program where ordinary men and women get matched up and went on dates for the whole country to watch. MBC said yes. Duo sponsored the production for 3 years, and the show called Love Studio became a massive hit. Think of it as one of the world's first matchmaking reality shows, decades before The Bachelor. And just like that, everyone in Korea knew who Duo was. Membership and revenue just took off. The business got so good and Duo grew so big that it crossed the legal threshold to disclose its earnings to the public. Basically, Korean law forces companies of a certain size to file audited financials for public disclosure. So even though Duo wasn't even a public company, it still had to open up its books. And those numbers are wild. As of 2025, Duo pulled in roughly 48 billion won, about 35 million US dollars, and it's posted the #1 revenue in the industry every single year since 1999. So what do you think happened once Duo proved that matchmaking could be a legitimate and lucrative business? Competition. Soon, hundreds of these so-called marriage information companies started popping up. The biggest rival is a company called Gayeon, founded in 2006. Gayeon actually claims that they're the #1 in the industry, citing the largest pool of members in the country, somewhere around 30,000. So now you've got two companies both insisting they're the #1. And the battle got so heated that in 2023, Gayeon actually sued Duo in court, trying to ban Duo's ads that bragged about having the most members and the most elite university graduates. The judge sided with Duo and let the ads stay. But think about that for a second. The industry is so obsessed with ranking people that the companies now rank fight each other in court. The irony is that very obsession is what earns them more trust and therefore more business and more money. Duo made so much money that they bought its own office building in Gangnam for around 82.5 billion won. That's roughly $60 million on a single property. The point is, the Korean matchmaking industry is much, much bigger than you think. So the question is, how are these companies able to make so much money? How much are members actually paying to make this kind of money possible? And you might be thinking, these agencies would just accept anybody because that's all money, right? Well, not quite. And this gets us to arguably the most uncomfortable truth about what really goes on inside these agencies, namely the qualifications, the spec sheets. So let's say you're thinking about getting married and want to look for the right partner. You quickly find out that going out to bars and clubs or using dating apps might not be the best way to meet someone for a serious relationship. So you basically ask your friends or colleagues to introduce you or set you up with someone on blind dates, which is actually the most socially accepted way of meeting someone new in South Korea. But then you exhaust those blind date opportunities as well. Couldn't find the one that you wanted to settle down with. Now what do? Enter the marriage information companies, matchmaking agencies. This could be your last shot. So you book a free consultation online, and on the day of the booking, you show up at their fancy office. Next thing you know, you're sitting across from a couple manager who starts asking some basic questions to fill out your basic information. Except the questions aren't basic at all. You're about to be interrogated in the most personally intrusive way possible, more than you've ever experienced at a job interview or even applying for a loan at a bank. You're about to fill out the spec sheet. Let's go through what's on it. I'll just list them out, not in any particular order. Your age, your height and weight, your education level, the name of the college you attended, your job title and your exact income before tax, your total savings, your total assets, and even how much debt you're carrying. Whether you own your home and where it is. Is it in Gangnam or outside of Seoul? Your religion, your family environment, whether your parents are divorced, and even whether they're financially independent in retirement, because apparently nobody wants to inherit the burden of supporting your in-laws. The number of siblings you have and what they do for a living. You get the idea? That's like everything. Well, if you're a guy, they will also ask you about your hairlines and whether you're going bald. But we'll come back to that one. Now, you might be wondering, can people just lie about all this? Inflate their salary and fudge their job title a little bit? This is where these agencies separate themselves from a dating app. They make you prove it, and you cannot join unless you do. You submit official paperwork, your graduation certificate to verify your school, an employment certificate, and tax records to verify your job and your real income. Oh, and here's a uniquely Korean one, a certificate proving you're actually single. Because in South Korea, your marital status is an official government record. So if you try to pass yourself off as single and never married, they will know the moment you've been divorced. Some agencies even have you sign an authorization form so they can run background checks through official government channels. And the high-end noblesse agencies, the ones whose entire pitch is matching the genuinely wealthy, go even further. Property registries, bank documents, even company financial statements if you own a business. I've seen examples of crypto millionaires getting rejected because they couldn't prove the value of their crypto holdings, or because that kind of wealth just wasn't considered stable enough. Pretty crazy if you think about it, but hey, whatever gives the members the comfort that everybody in the pool is verified. And here's how all that information gets transformed into a scoring, ranking, and tier system. Now, I have to make this clear. Every agency has a different proprietary system for how they score and rank members into different tiers. Officially, none of these agencies admit that they grade people, and we have no way of verifying whether that's true or not. But think about it. To match people of similar standing, you have to assign a grade and rank them in the first place. There's just no way around it if you have to systemize the whole operation across tens of thousands of members. This is like the worst kept open secret in Korea. Every Korean knows what to expect if they ever sign up with these agencies, okay? As a matter of fact, there was a popular TV show in South Korea in 2023 where they revealed an actual marriage agency scoring sheet. It's out of 100, and let me break down all the components. For a man, out of 100 points, his job is worth 30. His education, 25. His family background, 20. His personal wealth, another 20. And his looks, 5 points. That's it. So for a guy, 95% of his entire value comes down to his career, his school, his family's wealth, and his money. His appearance is basically a rounding error. Now, for a woman, out of the same 100 points, her appearance alone is worth 40. Family counts for 20. Her job, 20. Her education, just 10. And her wealth, 10. So here you can see how a woman's looks are weighted more than her job and her education combined. Bear in mind, this scoring sheet was just one example, publicly disclosed back in 2023, and these systems have almost certainly kept evolving since then. So what does the top of the food chain actually look like? From our research, here's who lands in the top tier, what they call S tier. For a man, it's almost all about status and wealth. The three most prized professions are lawyers, doctors, and CEOs. So imagine this. A doctor in his mid to late 30s, graduated from Seoul National University, which is basically Korea's Harvard. He makes over 200 million won a year, around 140,000 US dollars, which puts him in roughly the top 1 to 2% of all earners in the country. For comparison, the typical Korean worker earns about a fifth of that. And on top of all that, his father is also a doctor with property in Gangnam. A guy like that can essentially be matched with almost any woman he wants. Then there's the almost untouchable ultra VIP level, the founder CEOs and the sons of chaebol families worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The problem is, there just aren't very many of these men, but pretty much all women signing up with the agency wants to match with them. So when you get to these top S-tier guys, the disparity becomes stark. They have way too many options. What about S-tier for a woman? The single biggest factors are her age and her appearance, though increasingly her background, as in how rich her parents are, is being considered also. Either way, the beauty standard to land in S-tier is sky high. You basically have to be good looking enough to pass for a model, an actress, or a K-pop idol. In fact, the professions that tend to score highly on appearance are ones like flight attendant, TV news anchor, or anything in entertainment. And ideally, they are in their early to late 20s. As for the age thing, this actually points to a fascinating shift happening in the Korean marriage market right now. For years, the stereotype of these agencies was that they were for people in their 30s and 40s. There was this whole gold mist phenomenon, Korea's version of the girl boss. You know, women who focus on their careers through their 30s and then turn to an agency to find a husband once they were established. But according to the agency's own numbers, more and more women are now signing up in their early 20s, some still in college. At Kayan, signups from people in their 20s have climbed every year to an all-time high. Now, to be clear, people in their 30s and 40s are still the core of the market, but the 20-something surge is making the marriage market even more competitive, and the agencies have a pretty blunt explanation for it. These younger women, they say, are less focused on career and more focused on locking down a good partner early while their market value is at its peak. Those aren't my words. That's a theme being repeated by the agencies themselves. And it speaks to the brutal market logic underneath all of this. Because when the S-tier guys at the top have their pick and they're choosing specifically for marriage and kids, the agencies say that the track record is clear. Given the choice between an accomplished woman in her mid-30s and a younger woman in her 20s, a lot of these men go for the younger option. That's the uncomfortable reality the whole scoring system is built around. At this point, I don't want to give you the impression that guys are screwed and can't get matched at all unless they're millionaires. The vast majority of men signing up with these agencies are hardworking guys with stable jobs who genuinely want to meet a good woman, get married, and start a family. Same with the women. Not everyone can look like a Korean actress, right? Most members are just normal people. But at the same time, there are things that can completely sink you. Disqualifiers, so to speak, where the agencies won't even take your application even if you beg them. Let's focus on men here since that's the more common case. Basically, if you're unemployed, you're very likely to get rejected outright. And if you're self-employed or a freelancer, you'll have a much harder time, sometimes turned away entirely, even if you can prove you make great money. Because for these agencies, it's not just about how much money you make. It's whether that income is stable and verifiable. We've also heard from industry sources that a man significantly below average height, say under 160 centimeters or 5'3", will likely get rejected no matter how solid his job title is. Then there's one other interesting trait for men that might not get you disqualified right away, but can cost you major deduction points. And this one applies no matter how much you earn or how tall you are. Can you guess what that is? It's baldness. That's right. In the Korean marriage market, hair loss is a serious liability. And if you think I'm blowing this out of proportion, in late 2025, South Korea's president actually directed his government to look into whether the national health insurance system should start covering treatment for common male pattern baldness. He called it, and I'm quoting here, a matter of survival for young people in such a competitive appearance-obsessed society. So the moment you walk into a marriage agency, don't be surprised if one of the first things they bring up is your hairline. And here's the thing. It's not like these marriage agencies enjoy pointing out people's flaws or rejecting certain guys. Remember, they've got years of data. They can often tell right away if a certain profile is going to be tough to match because there just won't be enough women willing to meet him. For them, it's a simple matter of supply and demand in a brutally competitive market. So by turning some people away and stacking their roster with safer, more average members who will match, they push up their overall success rate. And the success rate, ironically, becomes one of their best marketing tools. So let's say you pass a screening, you're verified, and they've got a pretty good idea of which tier you belong to. What does it actually cost to join? And what do you get for it? For most regular people joining the big agencies like Duo and Gaeon, you're looking at somewhere between 2 to 4 million won, roughly 1,500 to 3,000 US dollars. And this isn't a yearly membership. It buys you a set number of introductions, usually around 5. So you're basically paying somewhere around $400 to $600 per well-vetted blind date. And once you run out, you pay again. That's just the basic service. And Duo keeps raising those basic fees 2 years in a row now, citing rising costs. But here's what's interesting. Even within the same service, the price isn't the same for everybody. It really depends on how desirable you are. A model-looking woman in her mid-20s or high-earning professionals or super wealthy men may pay less or in some cases get recruited for free because the agency wants them in the pool to attract everybody else. Meanwhile, someone who's harder to match or with very specific demands could end up paying more for the same introductions. So your spec sheet doesn't just decide who you get to meet. It decides what you have to pay to meet them. Now, say you don't want the basic service and just a few introductions. You want the VIP treatment, the full package. Those programs start around 10 million won, about $7,000, and at the very top, Duo's high-end service runs up to 50 million won, roughly $36,000. At that level, you get dedicated managers, hand-picked introductions, exclusive parties, the whole works. And remember, you can't even buy your way in. You have to qualify with the right specs. So no wonder these agencies make so much money, right? Members pay anywhere from a few thousand to tens of thousands of dollars, and you multiply that across tens of thousands of members. They're practically printing money. So what happens to the marriage market when this kind of all-out competition to be matched with the right person in the right tier becomes normalized? When an entire generation absorbs the idea that love is a zero-sum game, you win or lose based on your spec sheet. Does a system like that actually help people find each other, or is it quietly making Korea's marriage problem worse? That's what we need to talk about next. Let's zoom out for a second and look at the broad stats. In South Korea, the number of marriages fell from 329,000 in 2011 to 192,000 in 2022. That's a 41% collapse in a single decade. And of course, this is against the backdrop of South Korea's infamous birth rate, or more accurately, the fertility rate, which is just the average number of children a woman is expected to have in her lifetime. South Korea's fertility rate as of 2025 sits at 0.8 children per woman, the lowest in the entire world. Considering that you need about 2.1 children per woman just to replace the parents and keep the population at the same level, South Korea is basically headed for the population implosion that may be almost impossible to reverse. That's the context. So, what exactly is the message these marriage agencies are sending to the public? Regardless of their intentions, the message is this. You need to be competitive in the marriage market just to get a chance to be introduced to someone. That if you're a guy, you need to be at least a certain height. that you need a stable job and enough savings just to be considered average enough to spark any interest from the other side. So what do you do when you're told you're not even average enough to register because you happen to be between jobs, or you don't have much in savings since you're pouring everything into the business you're building, for example? You might feel judged, humiliated, or you just accept it as a reality of how things work in South Korea. Maybe you even self-filter and don't bother showing up to one of these agencies at all because you already know what they're going to say. And the result is that a lot of young Koreans, those who already struggle to find a decent job out of college and who know they will likely never afford a home in Seoul, just check out of the whole system. They tell themselves and their families and friends, yeah, I'm just not going to get married. Marriage and kids are too expensive anyway. And look, here at Asian Boss, we've done enough street interviews across South Korea over the years to see this firsthand. The vast majority said they didn't want to get married, and when we asked them why, the answer always came back to money. Now, earlier when I walked you through what was on the spec sheet, I said you have to write down everything, right? Well, that's not quite true. Sure, they'll make you provide evidence for all your externally verifiable traits, your job, your income, your assets. But there's a whole category of things they don't really bother finding out about up front. What are your values? What do you actually want out of life? Do you have any history of mental illness or any bad habits? What kind of character or personality are you looking for in a partner? How much are you willing to accommodate and sacrifice for someone else? You know, all the intangible stuff that's arguably way more important than the surface level criteria. To be fair to the agencies, most of them would actually agree that these things matter more. But they would say it's up to the members to discover all that once they match and go on a date, knowing the other person has at least been vetted on the basics and is in the same tier. They would argue that this is simply how the marriage market in South Korea works, and that this is exactly why people join to meet partners with a certain background. They say they're just facilitating market demand, and if you don't like being judged on external traits, well, they say you're free to go find someone on your own in a more natural environment, which sounds fair enough, right? Nobody's forcing anyone to join. But the reality for a lot of Koreans is that these agencies have become their last resort. And when it's your last resort, you don't really have the luxury of refusing to be judged. I suppose this does raise a bigger question about how South Korea became such a spec-driven society in the first place. A place where you're effectively building a resume from an early age just to compete for the right marriage partner. Long gone is the old ideal that two people simply come together to build something meaningful, to struggle and grow side by side. Instead, it's become all about optics. How people will judge you as a newlywed if you don't buy into the right apartment complex in the right neighborhood. Imagine the horror of having to tell your in-laws that you'll just be renting a small studio in a low-rise walk-up with no doorman. They might even call off the whole wedding for making their daughter suffer like this. You think I'm joking, but I've actually seen this happen to some of my friends, and it's more common than you think. And then there's the wedding ceremony itself, which is mainly designed to show off what kind of person you're marrying or what kind of family you're marrying into. The ceremony alone, which includes the whole hire and the food for guests, can run anywhere from $10,000 at a regular venue to $30,000 at a hotel. And if you want to get married at the Shilla Hotel in Seoul, the dream venue for just about every Korean out there, the total bill, the venue, food for 500 guests, flowers, lighting, the whole works, can run around 150,000 US dollars. And it's not uncommon for couples to actually borrow money to pull all this off. In one recent survey of the couples who paid their own way, nearly 60% took out loans, and almost 40% of them borrowed more than half of what the wedding cost. Getting married, in other words, has quietly become the end game in South Korea rather than the start of a long shared journey of responsibility and sacrifice. So what do you think happens to the couple who get matched this way through an agency, prioritizing each other's specs over shared values, treating the wedding itself as the finish line to be financed? Do they live happily ever after? Well, let's see. First of all, if you look at the viral headlines floating around Korean social media, Based on recent census data from 2022 and 2023, South Korea's divorce-to-marriage ratio reportedly approached a staggering 50%. That sounds like 1 in 2 marriages end up in a divorce. But the reality is a little more nuanced than that once you look into the methodology. If you look at the raw data for a single calendar year, South Korea recorded roughly 91,000 divorces alongside roughly 222,000 marriages. So of course, if you blindly divide those two numbers, it spits out a 45 to 50% ratio. But not all of those 91,000 divorces are coming from the newlyweds who tied the knot that same year. They're drawing from decades of accumulated past marriages. So the more accurate way of assessing the divorce rate is to look at who is actually splitting up. Turns out, there's a massive wave of what Koreans call newlywed divorce. According to the official data from Statistics Korea, couples who split up within their first 4 years of marriage accounts for a staggering 16.7% of all divorces in the country. You know what that means? That means nearly 1 out of every 6 divorces in South Korea happens to couples who haven't even celebrated their 4th year anniversary. That might not sound as crazy as the overall 50% myth, but it's still pretty discouraging, don't you think? You spend all that money at matchmaking agencies to vet your potential partner, making sure you belong in the same tier with similar family expectations, and yet 1/6 of them cannot even make it past 4 years. Could it be that this is the literal consequence of treating the wedding as the finish line? So that the moment real life stress hits and you realize you don't actually share the same values or vision, everything just falls apart? I don't know, just a thought. The younger generation in South Korea isn't stupid either. They see their friends taking out crippling debt just to clear the baseline social requirements of a respectable wedding, just to watch those same marriages fall apart a few years later because they were built on specs rather than actual substance. The bottom line is, while the agencies can say they're just facilitating a trend that already exists and that they're genuinely helping people find partners, you could just as easily argue the opposite. By pricing marriage and putting it on a scorecard, they're not just reflecting a materialistic society, they're formalizing it and even glorifying it. We know this because with the rise of YouTube in South Korea, a new wave of boutique and mid-sized matchmaking agencies is winning through viral content instead of the old TV ad and billboard model. And they're very open about assessing and grading people's specs and marriage prospects right there on camera. In 2026, this has even evolved into a form of entertainment where YouTube viewers can submit their own specs to be graded and critiqued by these agencies on camera for everybody to laugh along, mostly at the shocking lack of self-awareness from the applicants who think they deserve high scores. Again, I want to be fair to these agencies. In the end, they're legitimate businesses capitalizing on a very real market demand. They provide a service that thousands of stressed out, time-crunched people are actively looking for. And some of them, especially the founder-led boutique agencies, do seem to operate out of genuine principles. You will often see these founders reminding their viewers to lower their expectations and to remember that a human being cannot be entirely judged by externally verifiable specs on a resume. Speaking of expectations, I've already mentioned what's considered average for marriage is now totally getting out of control. But let me just give you one more example of how skewed the perception is becoming. Today, there's still very much of an expectation held by Korean women and their families that the men should be the one to provide a house for the marriage. And not just any house. A nice 2 to 3 bedroom, high-rise apartment that can easily go for almost $1 million in Seoul. Whether or not that's a spillover effect from the historical traditions we talked about earlier, when you place an expectation like that on men in their 20s, 30s, or even 40s, it becomes an impossible financial hurdle that will completely turn them off from marriage. Unless you have wealthy parents, no guy in his 20s and 30s can afford to buy $1 million apartment with his savings alone, even if his earnings are in the top 5%. So all these expectations on Korean men are actually manifesting in an interesting way, very interesting way. International marriage. An increasing number of South Korean men are now bypassing the domestic marriage agencies entirely to marry non-Korean women. Remember how I said earlier that the marriage rate declined 41% in a single decade? hitting that historic low in 2022? Well, by 2024, the total number of marriages in Korea suddenly increased by nearly 15% in a single year. And one of the defining structural trends driving this new landscape was international marriages rising for the third consecutive year. The top countries these women are from are Vietnam at number 1, followed by China, Thailand, and Japan. According to the latest census data, multicultural unions now account for nearly 10% of all new marriages registered in the country. That is a massive demographic shift. The most reported reasons for this boom are largely anecdotal, so take this at face value. But most Korean men surveyed said that the women they married didn't have unreasonable financial expectations like demanding $1 million apartment. They often opt for small weddings that don't require taking out a loan, choosing instead to start building their lives together modestly. Oh, and there's another super interesting stat that actually helps explain the recent rebound in South Korea's total fertility rate. Turns out, international couples once married in South Korea are simply having more babies. In fact, births from international couples suddenly soared by over 10%. One reason for this could be that non-Korean women are far less exposed to the intense social pressures regarding private education and hyper-competitive child rearing. They aren't spending thousands of dollars a month to send toddlers to English preschools. Whatever the exact reason, they seem far less shackled by the rigid expectations that apply to native Koreans. And as a result, they see more opportunities for their next generation in South Korea. The difference in perspective is truly fascinating. This is becoming such a mainstream trend and narrative that even the matchmaking agencies are planning their next moves. Obviously, if more Korean men bypass the marriage agencies altogether, that means female members are going to suffer from a shrinking pool of qualified men, right? So to adapt, the industry is seeing a massive surge in specialized, premium international matchmaking divisions. Their next big target market? Japan. Specifically, matching Korean men with Japanese women. This follows the latest official demographic reports showing that international marriages between Korean men and Japanese women increased by more than 26% in 2025 alone, while the first-time marriage rate between Korean men and Korean women effectively hit its lowest baseline since 1970. This record-setting trajectory is a massive wake-up call for industry insiders. So what does all this mean? The truth is, the Korean matchmaking industry is both a symptom and a cause of the falling marriage and birth rates, a devastating feedback loop, if you will. They're a symptom of a deeply rooted historical obsession with status, but they became the cause the moment they industrialized into cold, corporate scorecards. Ultimately, reversing this cultural trend won't come from the matchmaking industry. It'll depend partly on economic conditions, sure, but it'll also depend on whether this hyper-competitive, zero-sum culture can be shifted, something that probably won't happen in the short term. At the same time, maybe the real solution just requires a radical shift in perspective. Look at how international couples in South Korea see more hope and opportunities than local Koreans simply because they were never part of the system. So until the rest of Korean society experiences a perspective shift of their own, my guess is that the matchmaking empire will just keep printing money. If you found this video insightful and learned something new, make sure to subscribe to Asian Boss, hit that notification bell, and share this video with your family and friends. Lately, some of our subscribers have told us that they're not seeing our new videos recommended, so the only way to guarantee you actually get push notifications is by making sure that bell is turned on. Our mission is to be your authentic go-to source for Asia-related insights across business, tech, and culture, and we'll continue to bring you the most in-depth, objective reporting straight from the ground. To that end, we want to hear from you. So let us know in the comments what topics we should cover next. Help us grow bigger than mainstream media and reach a wider global audience. At least that would be the ultimate dream for me, but I genuinely believe we can make it happen together. Of course, I'm Stephen Park. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. And as always, stay curious.